Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. This video is part of a series of videos where I'll be going over the basic syntax of different programming languages. Now, one of the most annoying things about picking up a new programming language is having to learn all the syntax from scratch. In my own experience, it generally manifests in a lot of Google searching and Stack Overflow. For an experienced developer, the problem isn't understanding the concepts of programming, it's knowing how to implement those concepts in the new language. So things like variables, data types, data structures, loops, conditionals, and object orientation. All of these things are done a little bit differently in each programming language, and having to research how to do it all can be extremely annoying and tedious. In this video, I'll go through and show you the basic syntax for the most common parts of the language. I'll give you a brief history of the language, and we'll touch on some of the best practices and conventions used in that language. Now, this is meant to be a quick run-through. I won't be showing you how to install or configure anything, and we won't really have time to learn how to do everything. You see, I've distilled it down into what I consider the core concepts, so the goal for this is to be a quick video, so I can't cover every aspect of the language. With that being said, this video is meant for programmers who already understand the core concepts of programming. It's not going to teach you any programming concepts. I'll simply show you how to do all the common things in the new language. So if you are new to programming, Draft Academy has hundreds of videos where I hold your hand and I walk you through everything you need to learn to program, but this is meant for developers who already understand programming. So without further ado, let's get started. JavaScript is a high-level, dynamically typed and interpreted programming language that was created in May of 1995 by Netscape employee Brendan Eich. The language was famously created in only 10 days and adopted the name JavaScript as a marketing play, playing off the hugely popular Java programming language, although ironically the two languages are very different. JavaScript was built with the sole purpose of making websites more responsive and dynamic. Because it's able to respond to user interactions and access and manipulate the document object model, or the DOM, JavaScript allows web developers to make more dynamic and responsive websites. In 1996, the early version of JavaScript was adopted into a formal language specification called ECMAScript, of which JavaScript was the most well-known implementation. By specifying the language formally, all browsers could support languages implementing ECMAScript. So technically, JavaScript is based off of the ECMAScript specification. Today, JavaScript is a staple used on just about every modern website. It's become one of the three core web development technologies alongside HTML and CSS. Because JavaScript is a core web development technology, and most developers know it, JavaScript has been stretched beyond its original purpose. Nowadays, there are thousands of JavaScript frameworks, and it's even used as a server-side language with Node.js. JavaScript uses a garbage collector, and its syntax is loosely based on C and C++. Many developers choose to write JavaScript using a basic text editor. Generally, JavaScript will be written in the same environment as the HTML and front-end technologies that it interacts with. In many cases, JavaScript will be written directly inside of an HTML file, but can also be placed in its own separate JavaScript file and imported into HTML. So I'm going to show you guys a lot of the, just sort of JavaScript basics. We'll look at, how you can do a lot of the stuff that you would do in other languages in JavaScript, and I'll just kind of give you guys a full overview of the different stuff we can do. So first thing I want to talk to you guys about is how to set up your JavaScript. So there's really two ways that we can do this. JavaScript, like I said, it's tightly knit with HTML. So at least traditionally, you're going to be using JavaScript with HTML unless you're using JavaScript as a server-side language with something like Node.js. But in this case, we're just going to talk about using it with HTML. So over here, I have an HTML document, and one way that you can use JavaScript is directly embedded inside the HTML document. So down here, I have these HTML script tags. So it's just an opening script tag, a closing script tag, and then I have this type attribute, just text/JavaScript, and that just tells the browser that we're going to be putting JavaScript inside of here. And then in here, I have just a simple JavaScript command. This alert command will alert something out onto the screen. So this is one way that we can use JavaScript. Another way is by placing it into its own dedicated JavaScript file. So you'll see over here, I have another file, code.js. And this is doing another alert, so it's just alerting out some code. If you want, you can write your JavaScript in a separate file. The only thing you have to do, though, is up here in the head of the HTML document, you have to essentially just import it or link to it. So here I just have a script tag, and I'm just saying source is equal to code.js. So this is going to be a relative path from the HTML file to this JavaScript file. And what that'll do is it'll automatically bring in all of that JavaScript code. And the way that this all gets run is over here I have, like I said, my HTML file. And then over here, I have my browser open, and it's actually open to this HTML file. So whether this HTML file is just on your local system or on a server somewhere, basically this is how we're going to see the output of the JavaScript. So here I just have this index.html file open, and when I click refresh, you'll see that we're getting this first alert. It just says code.js. So that's the JavaScript code from that external file, and then we get another alert, inline.js. That's the alert that we got from here. So both of that JavaScript is linked up to this HTML file, and it's all working. For this tutorial, we are going to write all the JavaScript in its own file just so it's a lot cleaner. We don't have to look at the messy HTML. But yeah, let's get started. First thing I want to talk to you guys about is printing. So how can we actually like output information? Now, because JavaScript is so tightly knit with HTML, one of the most useful ways to do this is to output actual HTML. So here I have this document.write command, and document, this refers to the document object model. So it refers to the DOM, and I can just write something onto it. So over here, I'm actually writing out some HTML. So you'll see I have these header1 tags, and then inside of here, I actually have some, text. And you'll see over here on my web page that it's actually rendering this. So I have the header1 is showing up over here on the web page. And then down here, I have a horizontal rule that I wrote out to the screen, and I also wrote out a paragraph. So document.write will essentially write out HTML onto the page. So that text is actually going to get displayed on the document object model. Another way that we can output text is using this alert. So I showed you guys this before. This will just alert something out. So when I click refresh, it gives us this little alert. And another way that we can do it is with a console log. So this would be like logging a message to the developer console. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page. You'll see nothing shows up, but if I came down here and just clicked inspect, come over here to console, so you'll see there's this little console option here. Logging to the console shows up. So that text actually got output onto the console. So, those are three different ways that we can display or print out information. And generally, all three of those are going to be used in different situations. But the one takeaway is that with JavaScript, we can essentially write out to the actual HTML document. So I can modify or, write HTML from my JavaScript dynamically. Now let's talk about variables. So variables are extremely useful in JavaScript. Obviously, it's a container where we can store information. Variable names are case sensitive, and they can begin with letters, a $, or an underscore, and after they can include letters, numbers, $, or underscore. Convention says to start with a lowercase word, and then additional words are capitalized. So if I had a variable called my first variable, it would look like this with the second and third words capitalized just like that. JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, which means we don't have to specify the types, although there are a few different types that we can use. So over here we have a couple strings. So you can have a string with double quotes just like this, or you can have a string with single quotes. And whenever we have a variable, we always start it off with this var keyword. We can also represent different types of numbers. So obviously JavaScript has like a whole number, which we refer to as an integer, or a floating point number, just like this with a decimal. So some people will call those floating point numbers or doubles or just decimal numbers. And then finally we have a Boolean. So a Boolean is just like a simple 1-bit true false value. And you'll see over here, I can just declare the variable's name, and then I can give it a value later in the program. You can also modify a variable's value just like that. And then you'll see down here, if I want to print out the variable, I can just use something like concatenation. So over here, we're printing out your name is John, and I'm printing that out onto the document. All right, now let's take a look at how we can do casting and converting. So how can we, switch around our data types? So over here, I have 3 examples of converting a string that has a number in it into an actual number. So for example, I have like 100 plus, and then over here I have this string with a number trapped inside of it. So I could just say number with a capital N. And then over here, just place in the string. So what this will do is it'll convert this string into a number. As you can see over here, we get 125. And the same thing, I could say parse int, and what this will do is it'll parse an integer out of this string. So you can see we get 150 over here. We're able to add those numbers, and we can do the same thing for parse float. So we're parsing out a decimal number. And those can all be pretty useful if you're trying to get, for example, a number from a string. All right, now let's look at strings. So we're gonna go a little bit deeper into how strings work in JavaScript. You see over here, I have a string variable called greeting, and it just says hello. And the first thing I'll show you guys is the indexes. So JavaScript indexes strings similar to a lot of other languages, which means we start at 0. So even though H is technically the first character in the string, it's at index position 0. So we have 5 characters in hello, but the last character is at index position 4 because we start counting at 0. Over here I have some different string functions I can use. So greeting.length, this will tell me how many characters are in it, 5. Greeting.char at will give me a specific character. So char at 0 will give me this capital H because that's the character at index position 0. We could also say greeting.index of, and index of will basically check to see or tell us whether or not a specific substring or character is inside of a string. And if it is, it'll tell us at what index position it begins. So over here, greeting.index of LLO, you'll notice that we get a 2. That's because LLO starts at index position 2 in this string. If you pass in a string to index of that isn't inside of the string that you're checking, it'll just give you a -1. That's pretty standard across languages. And then we can also do like a substring. So if I say substring 2, this will give me this string starting at index position 2 and going to the end. So you can see we get LLO because LLO is at index position 2. And if I can also pass in another number, so over here I have substring 1, 3. So this is going to be a starting index and this is going to be an ending index. And it's going to be a non-inclusive ending index. So I start at 1 and then I go to 2 and then I stop at 3. I don't grab that third character, and that's why we get EL. So there's a bunch of these different string functions, you know, all the typical string functions that you would expect in a programming language. Obviously, you can just check out the JavaScript APIs for that. Now let's take a look at numbers. So numbers are extremely useful. You're going to be using numbers all throughout your JavaScript programming. And I'll just show you guys some of the basic stuff we can do with them. So over here I have like 2 times 3. I'm just printing that out. So JavaScript can do basic arithmetic. We can do addition, subtraction, division, and then obviously multiplication with the asterisk. Over here I have an example of an exponent. So 2 asterisk asterisk 3 will take 2 to the third power. So you see over here we get 8 because that's 2 cubed. And then we can also use the modulus operator. The modulus operator is going to give us the remainder of a division. So 10 mod 3 is going to give us 10 divided by 3. It'll give us the remainder of that. So 10 divided by 3 is 3, remainder 1. So over here you'll see we get a 1. We can also specify order of operations. So over here I have this little math equation. You see it's 1 plus 2 times 3. And normally JavaScript will do the multiplication first. So it's going to do 3 times 2 is 6 plus 1 is 7. You can see over here we get 7. But if I wanted, I could change the order of operations by putting parentheses around the 1 plus 2. So now it's going to do 1 plus 2 first, and then multiply that times 3. So 1 plus 2 is 3 times 3. And you see over here, when I refresh the page, we get 9. All right, and then finally, I want to show you guys how integers and doubles interact, or integers and floating point numbers interact. So over here, I have an integer divided by a floating point number, and you see that we get a floating point number back. If I was to change this floating point number to an integer, so now I have 10 divided by 3, the whole number, you'll see that we still get a decimal number back. So in certain languages, when you would do math on 2 whole numbers, then you'd get a whole number back. Not the case for JavaScript. So then down here, I have another variable called num. It just has the value of 10. And I have over here num plus equals 10. Plus equals is a shorthand for num is equal to num plus 100. So basically, I'm taking num, I'm adding 100 to it, and I'm storing it back inside the num variable. You can see over here we get 110 because 10 plus 100 is 110. And then you can do plus equals, minus equals, divide equals, and multiplication equals, and they all do the corresponding math operation. We can also do an increment operator, so num plus plus down here, that's going to add 1. So you can see over here we get 111. You can also do minus minus as the decrement operator. And then finally, JavaScript has a math class that you can use. There's a bunch of different, useful math functions. So we have math.pow, and that will take a number to a power. So like 2 to the third power, we get 8. And we can do square root. So math.square root, and again, this is a capital M, 144, so we get 12. And then math.round, we're rounding a floating point number, and that'll just round according to standard rounding rules. Obviously, there's more math methods. You can do stuff with like sine, cosine, tangent. You just have to kind of check out the API, and you can see all the cool stuff you can do with math. Now let's take a look at getting user input. So there's actually a bunch of different ways that we could go about getting user input in JavaScript, but this is probably the easiest way to do it. So what I'm doing here is I'm prompting the user. So I have this function over here, window.prompt, and basically what this is going to do is it's going to open up a prompt where the user can enter in some information. So I say window.prompt, and then inside of these parentheses, I'm basically just placing a prompt. So I'm, what I want them to enter. So I'm telling the user to enter their name. And then over here, you'll notice that I'm storing all of this inside of a variable called name. So whatever the user enters is going to get stored inside of the name variable, and then I'm just kind of alerting it out. So when I refresh the page, you'll see that we get this prompt over here. So it says enter your name, So if I entered my name, what it'll do now is it'll take the name that I entered, store it inside of this name variable, and then alert out hello to me. So it says your name is Mike. So that's one way that we can do it. You can also get user input by getting the values that are inside of text boxes. And I'm going to show you guys essentially how you can do something like that in a little bit. Now what I want to do is talk to you guys about how we can actually use JavaScript to interact with the HTML document object model. So HTML has a bunch of elements inside of it, and we can use JavaScript to dynamically modify or change or add things to those HTML elements. So over here, I'm back on my index.html page. And remember, this is the page where we're including that code.js file that we've been using. And what I have is an h1 setup over here. So you can see the h1 is over here. And this header one is an HTML element. You'll notice I have a couple attributes here. We have an ID. The ID is set to my header. And then I also have a custom attribute called draft. And it just says draft attr for draft attribute. Now, what I can do is I can go in my JavaScript code and I could actually grab this HTML element and I could actually use it. So I could modify it, or I could do different things, or I could access the attributes and do all sorts of stuff like that. So over here in my code.js file, I actually have some code to do that. One thing to note though is if I want to be able to grab an HTML element, the JavaScript code that I'm using has to appear below the element. So I have to put my JavaScript code down here. Now when I refresh the page, you'll notice that a bunch of stuff happened. So the page actually changed. So if I move the code up here back into the header, then it goes back to this. But now when I move this below this element, all of the JavaScript code that I wrote to modify this is gonna get activated. And over here in the JavaScript code, I'm gonna show you guys exactly what I'm doing to make these changes. So I have this header variable, var header, and I'm setting it equal to document.getElementById. Now getElementById is an extremely powerful function we can use, which will essentially allow us to grab a specific HTML element based off of its ID. So over here, I'm passing in my header, which remember is the ID that I gave to my header one. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm storing that HTML element inside of this header variable as a JavaScript object. Now, because I have this element stored inside of this header variable, I can actually access the specific attributes about the HTML element. So I could say like header.style, and this will allow me to modify the style attribute. So remember, the style attribute is how we would control CSS. So I could say like header.style and give it a bunch of information. So you'll notice I'm changing the color of the text to blue and the background color to red, and that all gets displayed over here. I could also grab a specific attribute from the HTML element. So over here, I'm writing out to the document header.getAttribute draft. And remember, draft is this custom attribute that I set up on my HTML element. So draft isn't a standard HTML attribute, right? It's not a standard HTML attribute that would be associated with the header one tag, but I created my own custom attribute, and then I was able to access it from over here in my JavaScript. So that can be extremely powerful. And then finally, if I want, I could change the actual text that's inside the tag. So I could say header.innerHTML, and what this will do is it'll change the actual text. So if I was to inspect this code, you'll see over here that the actual text that's inside of this H1 tag is Elephant Academy. So I was able to update it, and you can see like the style attribute got updated as well. So that's essentially how we can use JavaScript to grab and then modify or get information from the different HTML tags on our page. And that's really what makes JavaScript extremely powerful, is that JavaScript can go in and it can modify and it can access and it can traverse the document object model and do stuff with it. Now I want to talk to you guys about JavaScript arrays. So we can actually represent arrays in JavaScript, which are just structures where we can store multiple pieces of information. So over here I have a lucky numbers array, and I can just set it equal to an open and close square bracket, and then inside of the square bracket I can put all the different elements that I want to be inside of the array. So you'll notice I have numbers, but I can also store strings, and I can store Boolean values all inside of the same structure. And because JavaScript's dynamic, it allows us to do stuff like that. And then over here I have the different indexes. So JavaScript arrays are indexed similar to JavaScript strings. So I start the indexing off at 0. So the first element in the array is at index position 0. So this array has 6 elements, but the last element is at index position 5 because we start counting at 0. If I want to access a specific element inside the JavaScript array, I can just come over here, refer to the array name, and then an open and close square bracket, and then the index of the element that I want to access, and I can modify the element, or I can just get access to it. So over here, I'm printing out lucky number 0, which is 90, and I'm printing out lucky numbers 1, which is this 8. finally, I can print out luckynumbers.length, which will tell me how many elements are actually inside of the array, which we get 6. So one thing to note is that the length of the array and the last index of the array are different. So the last index is array length -1. If you don't know what elements you want to put inside of the array initially, you could just create an empty array just like this. And then obviously like you could add stuff in. So you'll see over here, we get 90. And then when I create an array that doesn't have anything in it and I try to access an element that's not in there, for example, luckynumbers.1 hasn't actually been set yet. It's just gonna give me this undefined value. And then obviously the length is gonna be 1. In addition to single dimension arrays, we can also represent n-dimensional arrays. So I could have like 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensional arrays. Over here, I have a 2-dimensional array, just to kind of give you guys an idea of how this works. So again, var, number grid, and giving it a name. And then inside of these open and closed square brackets, I can put other sets of open and closed square brackets to represent the individual 2-dimensional elements. And then I can access them using 2 open and closed square brackets. So this number is going to correspond to the element 0 or 1. And this element is going to correspond to the element inside of each one of those elements. So I could say 0, 1 is equal to 99. And you can see I can print out number grid 0, 0, so we get this 1 because that's over here. Number grid 0, 1 is going to be 99 because that's the one that we modified. So those can be pretty useful. And the same idea is used for other dimensional arrays. So you could represent like 3 or 4 dimensions. It's the same concept. Now let's take a look at some useful array functions. So if you have a dynamic array like we do in JavaScript, there's going to be situations where you're going to want to use different functions to modify or access or change those arrays. So over here, I just have an array var friends, and this is another way that we can create a new array. So before I was just using these open and closed square brackets, but you can also just say new array just like this, and that'll create a new array. And then I could say friends.push, so that'll push an element into the array. So I'm pushing Oscar, Angela, and Kevin. And then down here, I can print out the contents of the array. So you'll see I'm printing out Oscar, Angela, and Kevin. And then I can say index of, so I can check to see if a specific element is inside of the array. So I could say index of Angela, and this is going to give me the index position where Angela occurs in the array. So it's going to give me this 1. I could also say index of, if you put an element into index of that's not inside the array, it'll give you a -1 back. You can also reverse the array. So now we get the array in reverse order, or you could sort the array, and that will sort the array based off of the elements that are inside of it. So one thing you need to be careful with the sort is that if you have multiple data types inside of the same array, the sorting might not come out as you expected because there might not be a natural sort order for the elements in the array. When I have all strings inside of the array, it's easy to sort them alphabetically, but you just need to be careful with that. And then we could also pop an element off of the array. So I could say like friends.pop, and that'll pop one off the end. So you can see that Kevin element got popped off the end. So that can be pretty useful. And obviously there's more of these little array functions. You can just check out the API to get a full listing, but that kind of gives you an idea of how these work. Now I want to talk to you guys about JavaScript objects. So an object is essentially just like a dictionary. It's basically a structure where we're storing key value pairs. So it's a lot like an array, except instead of storing individual elements, we're storing key value pairs. So over here, you'll see that I have this object. So it's var student, and I just set it equal to, and it's an open and closed curly bracket, and that will denote that we want to create a JavaScript object. And then inside of here, we can actually define key value pairs. So I can define the key over here and then the value over here. So I have like name is mapped to Jim, his major is business, he's 19, and his GPA is 2.5. If I want, I could access the individual key value pairs inside of the JavaScript object just by referring to the name of the object dot and then the name of the key. So student.name will give me access to this key value pair. So I could change the name to Andy. And then I could also just print them out. So I'm printing out student.name, and that prints out Andy because we modified it. Student.major is going to give us business, and then student.gpa is going to give us 2.5. So that's essentially how a JavaScript object works. And that's really good for organizing, like objects of information. All right, now I want to talk to you guys about JavaScript functions. So in any programming language, functions are extremely useful. It's basically a container where we can place code that we want to reuse throughout our program. So over here, I can create a function just by saying function and then the name of the function. And function names are generally named the same as variables, so it's kind of the same syntax rules. And then over here, I can specify some parameters. So I'm specifying like num1 and then num2. And then over here, I can just return num1 plus num2. So this return keyword will break us out of the function. And if you put any values right next to it, it'll return that information back to the caller. So then if I want, I could call this function. So I have a variable sum over here, and I just set it equal to add numbers for 60. So this variable sum is actually going to store the value that gets returned from this add numbers function. And you'll see I'm printing it out. So we get 64 over here. So that's basically how we can use functions in JavaScript. All right, now I want to talk to you guys about another topic in JavaScript, which are event handlers. Now, event handlers are extremely useful, and it's another way that JavaScript can interact with your HTML document in order to make it more responsive. So in any HTML document, there's going to be different events that the user is going to do. So the user might scroll, the user might hover over something, the user might click a button, the user might move their window into a specific position. The user might do a bunch of different stuff on an HTML document. And one of the cool things about JavaScript is JavaScript can actually respond to those different events. So if the user clicks an element on my web page, JavaScript could respond to that and do something in response. If the user scrolls or hovers over something, JavaScript could respond to that. And the way that we can respond to those different events are by using things called event handlers. And event handlers are extremely easy to implement. So I'm going to show you guys essentially how we can do that. And I'll show you a couple different ways that we can do that. So down here, I'm in my index.html file, and I have a header1, and you'll notice that I gave this an ID. So the ID is just my header. And then over here, I have this other attribute called onClick. And this is actually what we would call an event handler. So what this is going to do is it's going to specify what should happen when the user clicks on this HTML element. So just by putting onClick on this HTML element, over here inside of these quotation marks, I can actually place JavaScript code. So anything that I put in between these quotation marks is going to be valid JavaScript code. And you'll notice what I did in here is I said handle click, and then inside of parentheses, I put the word this. Essentially what I'm doing in here is I'm calling a JavaScript function. And I actually defined this JavaScript function over here in my code.js file. So over here, you'll see that I have this handle click function, and it takes one parameter, which is element. So what happens now is if I refresh my page, if I click on this header one, you'll notice that this alert pops up and it says clicked my header. Essentially what's happening is over here in my index.html file, whenever this element gets clicked, this handle click function is going to get called, and it's going to pass into that handle click function the keyword this. And this actually stands for the current element. So I'm passing in the element that got clicked into the handle click function, and that's why I can come over here and say clicked element.id. So when I click this, it prints out clicked my header because my header was the ID of that element. Now, I want to show you guys a full list of all of these events. So there are tons of different events that you can respond to. And I'm over here on this website, W3 Schools. There'll be a link to this in the description. And over here, you can just get a full listing of all the different events. So you can see on click, that's the one that we used, on context menu, on mouse down, on mouse leave, on key press, on key up. There's all of these different things that you can respond to. So when the user does something on the browser, then your JavaScript can respond to that. And all you have to do is just place these inside of the attribute tag, just like I did over here. So just like I did here with on click, you could place any of these. So you could place like on blur or on focus or on focus in. You could do any of those inside of here, and then obviously like just call a JavaScript function, and then you could handle it from over there. So that's a really useful way to do this. Now I also want to show you guys one more way that we can do this, which is we can do it programmatically. So instead of defining that on click inside of the HTML, we could actually do all of it from inside this JavaScript file. You'll see the code over here has changed a bit. And back over here on this index.html file, you'll notice that I got rid of the on click attribute inside of this h1 tag. All I have here is just the ID. So what I can do is I can do exactly the same thing, but I can do it without having to modify the HTML element or put that on click attribute there. So over here in the code, you'll see I have var header, and I just set header equal to document.getElement by ID header. So I got that HTML element and stored it inside of this header variable. Over here, I could say header.addEventListener. And what this is going to do is it's essentially going to do exactly what we did before. It'll wait for the user to click. So if the user clicks, and you'll see over here I specified click right there, what it's going to do is it's going to execute this function. And I actually passed this function in over here as the second argument. So you'll see I just wrote out function, open and close parentheses, open and close curly bracket. And then over here, these two lines right there, those two characters are actually the end of that function call. So this function will take the event that you want to listen for, and it'll also take a function which is going to get executed when that event gets triggered. So whenever I click this Draft Academy header now, you'll notice that it says you clicked my header. So it's doing the same thing before. It's just that now we did it without having to put on click on this h1 element. And really, both of those are useful. You can do it on the HTML or you can do it programmatically. Now, one thing I do want to point out, when you're using add event listener, you'll see over here, I just typed out click. I didn't type out on click. When you're doing this programmatically using add event handler, you're just going to drop the on. So instead of saying on click, you're just going to say click. And that works for all of these. So over here, you'll see all of these are like on blur, on change, on focus out. Whenever you're doing it programmatically, you just drop the on. So it's just going to be like click or focus in or focus out. You're not going to put the on. You're only going to do that inside of the HTML. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can respond to different events, different things that the user does from inside of your JavaScript. And really that is kind of the core of what makes JavaScript awesome, right? That's what allows you to respond, and that's what allows you to make your pages more responsive, right? When the user does something, you can respond to it in your JavaScript code. So now I want to talk to you guys about conditional. So we're going to look at how you can implement if statements in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, if statements are pretty similar to other languages. So you'll see over here, I have two Boolean variables, is student is equal to false and is smart is equal to false. So what I can do is I could actually write out an if-else block to respond to those different values. So you'll see over here, I'm saying if, open and close parentheses, is student and is smart. And this and operator will allow you to check two conditions, as you can see we're doing there. You could also use the or operator. So I could say or like that, and that'll implement or logic instead of and logic. I could also use an else if, so I can just say else if just like that. And again, we're checking another condition. So over here, I'm saying else if is student and not is smart. So this exclamation point right here is the negation operator. So that will negate whatever condition comes after it. So I can say not, and that'll basically give me the opposite of the condition. And then over here, I can say else, and that'll just execute if neither of these guys up here is true. That's all pretty standard stuff. So up there, we were using Booleans as our conditions, but you could also use comparisons as your conditions. So comparisons will give you Boolean values. So I could compare like numbers. So I could say if 1 is greater than 3. So obviously that's false. But if I said 1 is less than 3, then you'll see over here, it says number comparison was true. So you can do greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than equal to, not equal to, which again, using that negation operator, or double equals, which is going to be equals. And then down here, you'll see we can also compare strings. So here I'm comparing this string to this string. Obviously, I'm saying not equals. If I was to say equals, now it's going to say string comparison was true. So you can compare strings just like you can compare any other data type. All right, another type of conditional that we can represent is a switch statement. So a switch statement is essentially just a specialized type of if statement, basically used to check one value against a bunch of different values. So over here, I have this variable my grade, and it's just equal to A. So what I can do is I can say switch my grade. So I'm passing in this value. And now inside this switch statement, depending on the value of my grade, we can do different things. So in the case that my grade is equal to A, we could write out you pass, and then we need this break statement, which will break us out of the switch statement. In the case that it's F, we could write out you fail, and then we also have this default case down here, which is basically going to execute when none of the cases up here are true. You see over here, I put an A, we get you pass. If I put an F here, it's going to tell me that you fail. If I put a Z here, that's not one of the valid grades, so it's going to tell me invalid grade. So that's basically how switch statements work in JavaScript. Now let's take a look at while loops. While loop is the most basic type of loop. It's essentially a loop that will allow us to keep looping over and executing a block of code while a certain condition is true. So over here, I have a variable index. It's just set equal to 1, and I'm saying while index is less than or equal to 5, I want to keep doing all this stuff in here. So I'm just going to write out the value of index and then increment it. So you'll see we print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So once it gets to 5, it increments it to 6, and then this condition up here becomes false, so we break out of the loop. One thing you want to watch out for are infinite loops. So if I was to get rid of this index plus plus line, then you're looking at an infinite loop because this condition is never going to be false. All right, one other type of while loop that we can represent is a do while loop, which essentially just reverses the order. So in a while loop, we check the condition first, and then we execute the block of code. In a do while loop, we execute the block of code first, and then we check the condition. So even if I set index up here equal to 6, you'll see it's still able to execute the loop body one time because we're executing the loop body before we are checking the condition. So you can use while loops or do while loops depending on what the situation entails. Now let's take a look at another type of loop, a more specialized type of loop, which is a for loop. For loop allows you to keep track of a particular variable or value as you go through the loop. So over here I have 4, and then inside of these parentheses I have 3 values. So I'm saying for, the first thing I'm doing is initializing a variable. So I'm saying for var I is equal to 0. And this is going to be my iterating variable. And then over here, after a semicolon, I have a looping guard or a looping condition. So I'm basically saying while I is less than 5, I want to keep looping. And then over here, this is a line of code that's going to get executed after every iteration of the loop. So it's just going to increment I. And then down here, I'm just printing out I. You can see we're printing out 0 through 5. That's a pretty standard for loop. And down here, we have another way that we can loop. So you can loop over structures. So I have this array right here, which basically just has a bunch of numbers in it. So I could say the array name dot for each. And for each is basically going to allow me to do something for each element inside of that array. And then inside of here, we're going to pass a function. So I'm just, as a parameter, I'm saying function. Inside of the function, I'm specifying that it's going to take one parameter, which is a lucky num. And this is actually going to be each element. So it's going to be the element each time we go through the loop. And then over here, obviously I have my function body. And then over here, we're ending off that for each call. So for each element in the array, I'm doing that. So now if I was to run this program, you'll see we're printing out 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. So I'm able to loop through all the elements inside of the array. Now I want to talk to you guys about exception catching in JavaScript. So a lot of times in your JavaScript programs, something might go wrong, an exception might get thrown, and it will end up breaking your program. So what we can do is we can actually handle those exceptions. So you'll see over here, I have this line. It says var x is equal to y plus 9. So this is a situation where I didn't actually define or declare this variable y. So JavaScript doesn't know what it is or doesn't know anything about it. So you'll see over here, I'm inside of this console. It says uncaught reference error, y is not defined. So basically this is something that happened that JavaScript couldn't handle, and so we got a reference error. So I'm gonna show you guys how we can handle this. So you'll see down here I have these try catch blocks, and inside of this try block, I basically have that same situation. And now if I was to refresh my page, you'll notice that we no longer get that reference error. All it's doing now is it's just printing out what went wrong. So I'm just printing out document.write error. So I have try, and then over here I have the catch block, and I passed into the catch block, or the catch block is going to take as a parameter something called ERR, which is just going to be the error that got thrown. And then over here we can print it out. So we can basically figure out what the error was. You can also have a finally block, and this finally, the code that goes inside of there is always going to get executed. So sometimes when an exception gets thrown, you're still going to want to execute some code no matter what. So no matter what happens, if this is able to execute, or if it breaks and we execute this code, finally code will always get executed no matter what. And also, if you want to throw an error, what you can do is just say like throw and then a message. So I'm putting this inside the try block. So now when I refresh, it says something went wrong. So this is how I'm able to throw an error or an exception in JavaScript. All right, now I want to talk to you guys about object orientation in JavaScript. So, we can use things like classes and objects and do all that fun stuff. So over here, I have a class. It's the book class. And down here, I basically just defined a constructor. And the constructor is going to take a title and an author. And then down here inside the constructor, I can say this.title. And what this is doing is it's referring to an attribute for the object that's getting created. So this.title is going to be basically a field or an attribute that's stored about this particular object that's getting created. So I'm saying this.title is equal to the title that got passed in. This.author is equal to the author that got passed in. So down here, I'm essentially just defining two attributes, title and author, and then initializing them with the values that got passed into the constructor. And you'll see down here, I have a little function. So when you're inside of a class like this, you don't need to put the function keyword. You can just type out the name of the function. And down here, I'm just writing out document.write reading this.title by this.author. So again, the this keyword is going to refer to the particular object that is calling this function. And then down here, I'm creating an object. So I'm creating an instance of the book class. So I'm just saying var book1, I'm creating a variable, and inside of the variable, I'm storing a new book object. So I'm saying new book, and then in here, I'm passing the title and the author. So when I say book like this, and then open and close parentheses, I'm basically calling the constructor over here. And then down here, I'm just saying document.write book1.title. So we're printing out Harry Potter, and then book1.readbook. So it says reading Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. So that's basically how we can implement classes and objects in JavaScript. All right, next I want to talk to you guys about getters and setters. So getters and setters are basically little functions which allow you to control the access that the user has to the particular attributes in your class or your object. So down here, I have this get title and this set title. So basically I'm creating getters and setters for the title attribute. So I just said get, and then the name of the attribute, so it's title, open and close parentheses. So this is going to be my getter, and I basically just had it print out getting so we could see that this is working, and then it's just returning this dot underscore title. So I say this dot underscore title, basically this is referencing the actual attribute that's getting stored inside of our object. And then title is the actual function. So just use this underscore when you're using this, and that'll refer to the actual attribute. And then I can just say set title, and then it's the same thing. So this is taking in a title, and I'm just saying document.write setting, and then I'm saying this dot underscore title is equal to title. So as long as you set it up like that, then these will act as getters and setters for the attributes of your class. And then down here, again, just creating the book object. And here I'm saying document.write book1.title. And when I say book1.title, it's actually going to go through that getter. So actually, why don't we walk through this? I'm saying new book, Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. When I come up here and I execute the code inside the constructor, you'll notice that it's saying setting. So it's setting the title attribute. So when I say this.title, it's actually executing this function down here. And then over here, I'm just saying book1.title. So I'm getting the book. And you'll see over here, it's calling that getter. And then over here, I'm saying book1.readBook, and it's saying reading Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. So it's using that getter from inside the read book. So now anytime that we access the title, it's going through those getters and setters. And what's cool about this is the way that we access the attribute and the way that we access the getter and the setter are exactly the same. So you don't have to implement the getters and the setters until you actually need them. And then the client code that's using those attributes isn't going to have to change at all. It can stay the same. So I wouldn't have to change this to like get title or something. It can stay exactly the same. And that's something that's really useful. All right, now I want to talk to you guys about inheritance. So inheritance is, a staple in any object-oriented programming language. So up here, I have actually two classes. So I have this class chef, and this is basically just modeling a chef in my program. And you'll notice down here, the chef has a constructor, and it's going to have a name and an age. So every chef will have a name and an age. And then down here, the chef can do a bunch of stuff. So the chef has like a make chicken function, a make salad function, and a make special dish function. So all these do is basically just write out what the chef is doing, right? So this is my chef class. And then down here, I have a more specific type of chef, which is an Italian chef. And the Italian chef is actually inheriting all the functionality from the normal chef. So you'll see over here, I have Italian chef, and then I'm using this keyword extends chef. And so what this means is that the Italian chef is going to inherit all the functionality and attributes from the superclass, from the chef class. And then over here, I have a custom constructor that I made. So you'll notice that the Italian chef is actually going to take, in addition to a name and an age, also going to take a country of origin. So down here, I'm saying we're going to take in a name, an age, and a country of origin. And what I'm doing over here is I'm saying super, name, and age. And what this is doing is it's using the chef's constructor, it's using the superclass's constructor to initialize the name and the age. And then I'm just defining code to initialize the country of origin on the Italian chef. And down here, the Italian chef has an additional function, which is make pasta. And then the Italian chef is also overriding the make special dish function from the chef class. So the chef class over here has a make special dish function, you'll see. And then the Italian chef down here is overriding that. So it's now saying the chef makes chicken parm. And then down here, I'm creating a chef object. So I'm saying var chef, and I'm storing inside of that variable a new chef object. So I'm just saying new chef, and then I'm calling the constructor. So I'm just passing in Gordon Ramsay and then 50. And then down here, I'm creating an Italian chef object. So I'm saying my Italian chef is equal to new Italian chef. And remember, the Italian chef is going to take three things. So it's going to take the name, the age, and the country of origin. And then down here, you'll notice I'm just printing out my Italian chef.makeChicken. I'm also printing out my chef.makeChicken. So both of these objects are able to make chicken. And if I was to print out make special dish on the chef and then make special dish on the Italian chef, if I refresh the page, you'll see the normal chef is just making a special dish, and the Italian chef is making chicken parm because I overwrote it. And then down here, I'm just printing out my Italian chef.age because that got set. So that kind of shows you guys how to use inheritance. And then also how we can call a superclass's constructor from the subclass. Now, I will point out that if I was to get rid of this constructor, so I got rid of the constructor in the subclass, and then I'm also going to have to get rid of this argument down here. You'll notice that when I run the program, it's still doing exactly the same thing, except now I don't have access to that country of origin on the Italian chef class. So if you don't define a constructor in the subclass, it'll automatically use the constructor in the superclass. All right, so that is essentially everything that I wanted to show you guys in JavaScript, and that kind of covers all of the main points. So we covered, just some vanilla JavaScript stuff, and then obviously some object-oriented programming stuff. Now, one thing I will say with JavaScript, and this is true of anything that's getting implemented on the web, is you need to watch out for browser compatibility. So, there's a bunch of different browsers out there, Internet Explorer, Edge, Chrome, Firefox, Opera, all of these different browsers. And the problem is that it's up to the browser to be an interpreter for the JavaScript. So one problem that a lot of people run into is that when a new version of ECMAScript, which is the JavaScript standard, comes out, you'll hear people talking about like ES versions, like ES5 or ES6. Those are ECMAScript versions, basically just new versions of the JavaScript standard. And the problem is that it's up to the browsers to support those new versions of ECMAScript. So a lot of times what will happen is a new version of ECMAScript will come out and there'll be all these new features in JavaScript, but some or all of the browsers won't support those features just because they haven't gotten around to it yet. So that's one thing that you need to watch out for in JavaScript is browser compatibility. But for the most part, browsers are pretty much on their game, and whenever a new version of ECMAScript comes out, they're able to implement it pretty quickly. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.